We now have our second Nobel laureate of the day. I guess one shouldn't have favorites among Nobel laureates, but I was particularly delighted to be allowed to have this conversation with Professor Kahneman. He is a particularly timely person for us to be talking to. I think we're really, really lucky to be able to hear from him because, as I'm sure everyone knows, he is really the father of behavioral economics. Someone who has been thinking about the ways that we make choices and make decisions that are not perhaps purely homo economicus. And so I wanted to start, Professor Kahneman, by asking you, has this financial crisis changed the way we think about thinking and we think about economics? Has it been a triumph of the behavioral economists over the classical economists? Have you guys won?
Well, in the first place, a very important disclaimer. I'm not a behavioral economist because I'm not an economist. And I don't think that people who are not economists should call themselves behavioral economists. I'm a psychologist. I happen to know a lot of, I have a lot of friends who are behavioral economists, and so I can talk about that. But you should know that I'm not talking.
And they read a lot of your work,
don't
they?
Yes, but I'm not talking as a professional. Whether this has been a triumph for behavioral economics, yes and no. The yes side is that it clearly hasn't been very good for classical economics, especially for naive classical economics. The kind of, the economics that apparently Alan Greenspan believed in, up to the point that his framework collapsed. It hasn't been good for that. Whether it's been especially good for behavioral economics, I'm not sure, because there is one aspect of it, clearly, that behavioral economists are extremely interested in, and this is at the level of the people who are buying mortgages that they couldn't afford. This is a classical example of behavior that could be rational and where behavioral economics would think that people do need protection against bad choices that they would make for themselves. So on that issue, I think clearly behavioral economics is relevant, and I think people are going to take that more seriously in future.
And they'll take it more seriously how? By preventing us from making bad choices? Is that what governments need to start doing more?
No, that's a bad word, preventing people from making any choice. But by trying to help people make choices that are better for themselves without abridging their freedom. It's treading that fine line. This is what nudge is all about. This is what modern behavioral economics is.
And how can you do that? How do you avoid preventing me from doing something bad?
Well, by making sure, by imposing on the people, for example, who tell you something about a privacy policy, not to obfuscate. This is something that can be regulated. That is, that information that people should have should be in plain English, so that you do not need to be a professional lawyer to understand it. So that mortgages and agreements with credit card companies should be summarized to a paragraph that somebody can read and understand. And this is a matter for regulation, and I think it's going to involve a lot of fighting because commercial interests are dead opposed to it. But at least in the United States, currently, we have a behavioral economist, or we have Cass Sunstein as chief of regulation, and so you couldn't do much better. And clearly, this is very close to his interest: is helping people make better decisions for themselves without abridging their freedom, so-called libertarian paternalism.
Is that a lesson that needs to be applied also in the sort of financial sphere, in the way we think about regulating banks?
Well,
in the way we regulate markets?
Now we're approaching a domain where I'm not an expert. So, I'm not an economist, and so my sense is that this is something that standard economics and behavioral economics, are interested in. And this is the agency problem. That is, how do you, that clearly the interests of individuals do not necessarily coincide with the interests of the organizations to which they belong, and that's a problem in standard economics. Apparently Alan Greenspan wasn't fully aware of it, but many other economists are. And And regulating that and thinking about the psychology of incentives, and to that extent, I think that is extremely important, and probably is in the background of some of the activities that are going on in trying to regulate finances.
And do you think that's something that governments have to get involved in, or should they rely on companies to regulate internal incentives themselves?
Well, I mean, you know, who are companies? The companies are boards, and they are executives, and the executives very frequently control the board rather than vice versa. And so I think there is a role for government. Obviously, there is a role for governance within organizations as well. But there is a role for government in making sure, for example, that shareholders' rights are appropriately considered when the boards make decisions. So, you know, you're speaking to somebody who is a bit of an interventionist on this.
In retrospect, I think a favorite game right now played, I must say, often by journalists, is to point out how idiotic everybody was in government, in finance, in business, and that this crisis was really very obvious. If anyone had been thinking clearly, they would have known it was coming. Are we making a cognitive error in thinking about it that way?
Oh, yes, we are. I mean, one of the major cognitive biases that have been identified by psychologists over the past 30, 40 years is hindsight bias. And hindsight bias it's not a pernicious mistake. It's something that everybody does. That is, we are unable to reconstruct a day after the event occurred what probability we had assigned to it yesterday. That is, when people were explicitly asked for their probabilities for various events, and a few weeks later the event either had or had not occurred, and you ask them with incentives to reproduce the probability they had stated, they're unable to do it. They tend to be biased that they thought the event would always occur. And this is
so we always think that we were right?
We always think that we're right. It takes very, very little time for people to convince themselves, and we really understand the psychology of this extremely well. That is, an event occurs, and we are so built that we're storytellers. As soon as anything happens, we have a story for it, and we understand it. We understand the story that we're constructing for it. And then that story becomes part of the event. We cannot think of the event without thinking of that story. And now the event makes perfect sense. And that makes us very unfair to the people who are making decisions without the benefit of knowing its outcome. And it has another very pernicious consequence, I think. It gives us the illusion that we understand the world we live in. Because, you know, so we made that mistake. We didn't anticipate this crisis, but, you know, now we've learned.
Now we know. Now we know better this time.
But actually, the real lesson we should learn is that there are a lot of things that happen in the world that we cannot anticipate. That's the important lesson, and not so much what we can learn from this particular event. Actually, I would think people overlearn from experience. It's not that we don't learn enough from experiences. We also learn way too much from experiences.
What do you mean by that? It seems
Well,
impossible. Surely we should always be learning from our
What I mean by that is, I mean, you know, the experience, like the expression of fighting the last war is an example of learning too much from an experience, is that it narrows the way that you think about the future. And it produces that illusion that you really know the future, or that the future is knowable. So humility with respect to what was foreseeable is, I think, a very, very good idea. I think it is true that some people foresaw it, but, you know, for example, somebody I respect enormously, Nouriel Roubini, everybody respects him these days, but it is true that he had been predicting a lot of disasters before that disaster happened, and that was true of a number of people.
You don't believe in the stopped clock theory of Nouriel Roubini?
No. I mean, I think that, you know, he may, many people saw that, you know, and they were vindicated, but people who were as knowledgeable and as intelligent as the people who did see it did not see it. And so I would want to be very careful about deciding, you know, about concluding, oh, this was easy to see. It was not easy to see, otherwise it would have been seen.
And so bearing in mind that hindsight bias, what should we be learning from the past crisis? I guess I'm not supposed to be learning anything from it at all, right?
Well, no, you're supposed to learn. I was mentioning to you earlier, Nassim Taleb, who is one of the heroes, clearly, of this particular story. But Nassim Taleb is writing another book to follow his Black Swan. And He has a subtitle for his book, which I really like. And the subtitle is How to Live in a World That We Do Not Understand. And that, I think, is an important lesson. And there are ways to adjust to some humility about how much we understand the world we live in. And, thinking small and taking 2 insurance policies and reminding yourself morning and evening that you don't know, and having some fairly obnoxious, if you will, quality controls over the decisions that are made.
For yourself, for your company, for your government,
for yourself,
all of those?
There are too many books give people advice. I don't think that people can follow advice to correct their own thinking. But I think
you don't think we can follow advice to correct our own thinking?
No.
That's
think
so
it's
depressing.
So
we're
just too
we're
much
doomed
work, too
to
hard.
just think in the
Pretty
irrational
much.
way people do.
Pretty much. I mean, you can. As individuals, I don't think that. Speaking for myself, I haven't learned all that much.
Really? So you're not a super excellent decision maker?
No, not at all.
Really? You haven't used all the things you know in your research in your life?
Well, sometimes I use them, and there is a particular way in which they can be used, but it's also quite rare. That is, you can be in a situation, and an example is like there are visual illusions that we have seen before and we recognize, and we say, oh, that's a Müller-Lyer illusion. Those 2 lines look different, but they're really the same. Now, when you see that pattern with the arrows pointing in or pointing out, then you should say to yourself, and you can say to yourself, oh, here, I can't trust my vision. I have to take out my ruler. I have to ask someone.
That's a pretty narrow application, though.
And there are a set of narrow applications where this might work. Organizations have a better chance in some way. That is, you can embed procedures. You can embed some wisdom into procedures for decision making. That until somebody gets clever enough to subvert those, and I think I've been told it takes about 5 years to subvert anything, but until people do find the loopholes in your procedure, you can do things within organizations to improve decision making.
And what sort of procedures should we be embedding?
My favorite these days is a procedure invented by a fellow named Gary Klein, whom I like, and that is the pre-mortem. And I think that's a very fine idea for an organization, so let me share that with you. If you have an organization that has made a plan, and it's not yet fully determined, but it's almost decided, then it's a very good idea to bring in executives or people who are going to be involved in this plan for a session that could last 3/4 of an hour. It shouldn't be a big deal. Give them paper and pencil and run a meeting on the following premise. You tell the people there, it is a year from today. We implemented the plan. It was a disaster. Now please write the history of that disaster. And give people 5 minutes to do that. This, I think, is brilliant. It is brilliant because it overcomes one of the major problems for organizations if they're making decisions, which is that